And we have to begin to prepare for that. And what we have to do is we have to have a story of victory. Okay. So the argument that Netanyahu will be positioned to make is that Iran was an existential threat on February 27th. Today, when the war ends, it is no longer an existential threat. Mission accomplished. That's sort of one big dimension to this. The second dimension to this is I think Israel is in real trouble. As I said to you before, the reports out of Israel are that 80% of the missiles are getting through, the Iranian missiles. And there's no evidence that the Iranians are running out of missiles. And this is beginning to look a lot like the June war of last year. Remember, the Israelis ran out of missiles then, or were running out of missiles. They didn't completely run out. And you're in a similar situation now. So unsurprisingly, the Israelis look like they're willing to go along, at least as best we can tell from the outside. But here's the question, Danny. If you, Danny Davis, are playing the Iranian side, are you going to be willing to let the Americans and the Israelis walk away, have a ceasefire, and allow them to reload the shotgun and come back after you 6 months from now or in a year?
Well, that's what I was about to ask, because, I mean, let's just forget about 6 months to a year. How about 6 hours later? Whatever President Trump ends up saying tonight, I mean, we still have this to negotiate with. They're already making plans to formalize control of the Strait of Hormuz. So, I mean, this is not like the Red Sea situation with the Houthis last year, where President Trump got tired and said, well, all right, this isn't going to work out. Let's just declare victory, and that they begged us for a ceasefire and we'll walk away. We won't shoot them. They won't shoot us. And that worked pretty much. This one isn't like that because of all the things that have happened here and the fact that they have control of the strait. And as you say, that they're one major flex or leverage over us. Why would they ever give that back? So paint some scenario to me, what Netanyahu and Trump could do collaborating tonight, whatever they may say, that's going to make it to where leaving Iran in control of the strait can somehow be twisted into a victory.
Well, we're in the realm of speculation because we don't know what the president's going to say.
Right.
But I think there's a lot of evidence that he's going to tell a two-part story. First is he's going to declare victory, or he's going to say we're on the verge of victory. And then the second thing he's going to do is he's going to say we're going to walk away. We're going to end our participation in the war. This is the end. And those are two separate issues. Just very important to understand that. The question is, can he tell a narrative about victory? Can Netanyahu tell a narrative about victory that convinces anyone but themselves, and maybe doesn't even convince themselves? Okay. And then the second question is, can we walk away? And let's just talk about those two issues separately. Just first, let's focus on the victory narrative. As I said to you before, these two men stated very clearly before the war that they had a series of objectives. It was never clear which was number one, which was number two. They did bounce around, but it was clear that there were basically five big objectives, however you want to package them. One was regime change. Two was ending nuclear enrichment. Three was ending the ballistic missiles. Four was supporting, ending support for the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And fifth, maybe, is they were talking about wrecking Iran. They've achieved none of those objectives, and they're not on the verge of achieving any of those objectives. If you listen to Marco Rubio the other day, he said we had limited objectives. Number one is we wanted to destroy their Air Force, and that's what we did. We wanted to destroy their Navy, and that's what we did. And Third, we don't want them to have nuclear weapons, and they're not going to have nuclear weapons. You just sort of say to yourself, is this a serious argument? Who was talking about destroying their Air Force and their Navy as an important military objective or political objective before the war? The answer is nobody, because it's not a big deal. Their military power doesn't revolve around their Navy and their Air Force. And they didn't have a nuclear weapon before the war. They weren't pursuing a weapon. And the fact that they don't have a nuclear weapon now, a month later, is hardly surprising. But what's going on here, Danny, is they failed to achieve any of the major objectives that they put forward before February 28th. And furthermore, as I said to you, now the strait is closed. The strait is closed, and this has huge economic consequences. Furthermore, egregious damage has been done to the various Gulf states that are our allies.
And I'm sorry, I got some breaking news here. A couple of pieces. One is the Iranian Foreign Ministry has responded to President Trump's claim, saying, quote, President Trump's claims that Iran requested a ceasefire are false and baseless. So no truth to that. Then maybe the bigger is this one right here, is that Iran fires a major missile salvo ahead of Passover holiday. Initial reports suggest 10 ballistic missiles were fired in the past few minutes. So this is just happening right now. One would imagine that this is kind of a response and a reply to the Iranian side that says we do have control of the Hormuz, like you said, but we also still have full control of our missile inventory. And if anybody thinks that you're going to declare victory, let me just put a little fire on that one. I mean, what do you see about that message, and what is that going to do to what may happen later tonight?
Well, again, that's just more evidence that the victory narrative is not going to work, right? I mean, who's going to believe this is a victory? This is a giant loss for the United States of America and Israel. We lost. Let me put it differently. We haven't lost because the war is not over with yet, but we are clearly losing the war. And nobody can tell a story about how we turn things around and actually win the war. But the Iranians are in the driver's seat, and launching those missiles at Israel at this juncture is just evidence of that. But that's one issue. The other issue, one could argue it's an even bigger issue, is can we walk away? I mean, have you thought about this, Danny? How do we walk away from this? I mean, I think the best way to walk away is just to leave the region. Just take everything and go home, right? But we're not going to do that, of course. We're going to stay in the region. So we're not leaving the region. We're just leaving the war, whatever that means. Again, let's go back to the Iranian side. Danny Davis or John Mearsheimer is playing the Iranian hand. And the Americans say, we're going to stay. We're going to stay on bases in the Gulf states. We're going to keep our businesses there. We're going to have our Navy there. We're not going to lift sanctions. We're not going to pay reparations. But we want the war to end, and we want you to leave us alone.
Sure, why not?
I mean, does this make sense? If you're the Iranians, aren't you going to target American military bases for the foreseeable future? You know, there are those troops from the 82nd Airborne that have now been inserted somewhere. I don't know exactly where they're located. Aren't you going to seek them out and try and target them? Aren't you going to go after, even if you don't go directly after the United States, aren't you going to go after the 6 GCC states, the Gulf states, our allies? And if you go after our allies, what does that say about extended deterrence?
Yeah.
You know,
listen, wait, we're running a little bit low on time here, and 2 more things I want to get to before we let you go, because we're so important. One, you mentioned the 82nd Airborne. That's to go along with the Marines and Army Special Forces Rangers that are already on the ground here. One of the other possibilities that someone was concerned about is, and I'm talking about people in the region. I've got some sources that have connections to people who are part of that force, and they say that they basically have, I don't know if orders is the right term, but implications that they either need to be ready to go in to something on the ground, and of course for operational security, and they don't want to, get in trouble for passing classified information on, but something that they're going to tell that they need to be ready to execute on a dime, or they need to be ready to withdraw on a dime. So that's how complicated and confusing it is on the ground. In the event that they try something, anything on the ground, Carg Island, Kashim Island, you name it, with that ground force, does that change the dynamic any for you?
Yes, it makes a bad situation. Let me change my language. It makes an absolutely terrible situation much worse. I mean, what we were talking about declaring victory and then walking away from the fight. What you're saying here is that what we might do is up the ante, insert ground forces. And the Iranians have made it clear what they're going to do if we insert ground forces in any territory that they own. They're not going to only fight against those ground forces to the death. They're going to go after countries like the UAE that are going to help us. And they're going to unleash the dogs on the UAE. I mean, the war is just going to escalate. I mean, putting ground forces into the fight is going up the escalation ladder. It's the polar opposite of what we expect President Trump to say tonight. I mean, he may not say that he's walking away from the fight and he's declaring victory. He might say, I'm going to double down and I'm going to send in ground forces and I'm going to work with UAE and other Gulf states to win this war. He could do that, but that would be crazy. But
yeah, it would be, and let's hope we don't get that, because that would just be a bloodbath for our troops that wouldn't help anything. And God help us if we get there. I want to shift gears in the remaining time we have here to the other major issue that's happening this morning. President Trump getting ready for his inauguration tonight was reported on Reuters this morning that he is threatening a NATO exit. And he was pretty strong language here. He says Trump told Reuters on Wednesday that he would state in an address to the nation later in the day that he was absolutely considering withdrawing the U.S. from NATO. I'll be discussing my disgust with NATO, he said of the speech. Asked if he was thinking about pulling out, he said, oh, absolutely, without question. Wouldn't you do that if you were me? President Trump's remarks came just hours after his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, declined to reaffirm U.S. commitment to NATO's collective deterrence, meaning our Article 5 obligation. That follows some recent comments just in the last 24 hours where President Trump and Marco Rubio and Secretary Hegseth, they're all, showing their anger at Europe for not coming in militarily with naval power or any other kind of power to join the war, saying, well, then what do we even have a NATO for? Implying, and this is what I'd like you to address, that even though there's not an Article 5, which means if you're attacked, that people come to your aid, it sounds like they're thinking that just because when we're in charge, if we choose a war, you should still feel an obligation to come and fight with us, even though there is no Article 5. What do you make of this?
Well, I think your description of what's going on is correct. There was no attack against the United States, which would justify invoking Article 5. President Trump, what he likes to indicate is that we're on the verge of opening the strait with a little more military power. And if we can get the Europeans to commit to help us open the strait, we could do it. And the fact that the Europeans won't commit means the strait won't be open. And that's their fault. We've done the lion's share of the lifting up to this point, but we need a little bit of help, and they won't give us that help. And therefore, it's perfectly appropriate for me to hold them in contempt and pull out of NATO. I have two comments to make about that. First of all, the idea that NATO navies would make a difference in breaking through the Strait of Hormuz is not a serious argument. The United States Navy is the most powerful Navy in the world, and it cannot go through the strait by itself. It's just not in the cards. And any European naval forces that we add on to an attack force are not going to help us get through the strait. It just doesn't matter. My second point is that what's going on here is that President Trump is preparing to blame the Europeans for the disaster in the Gulf. President Trump is not going to want to take responsibility for this. We all know how President Trump operates. Even though he started this war, and the Europeans had nothing to do with starting it, and even though President Trump can't win it and the Europeans don't matter in terms of helping us win it, he's going to blame them. It's President Trump, it's always somebody else's fault. And that's what's going on here. So I find this hardly surprising. Whether NATO remains intact as a formal institution, I don't know. But as a meaningful military alliance, I think it's effectively dead.
Well, let's take a look at what that would mean here. If Trump withdrew under the current circumstances, meaning that we didn't have a coherent and cooperated and coordinated end of said, let's just draw this thing down and part as friends kind of thing. But you just say in a tantrum, all right, y'all, I'm sick and tired of y'all. We're just leaving. And who knows what that physically would look like. And I mean, it would be a monumental move to get troops out and all that kind of thing. But the damage, I think, psychologically and relationally between the United States and Europe, can you just take, what are some of the potentials that could come from such a ripped up divorce on a spur of the moment?
Well, it could permanently damage transatlantic relations. They're already poisonous. And, lots of people think there's a possibility that President Trump may turn things around, or we can sit out the remaining almost 3 years. And then at that point in time, we'll have a new president and you can fix things. I think that's hardly likely at all. But it's very interesting here, Danny. In the old days, what we used to focus on when we talked was the Ukraine war. And we hardly talk about Ukraine anymore because the Iran war is front and center. But as you and I both know, the Ukraine war is going on. And the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And they're in more trouble than ever because this war is having a deleterious effect on the Ukrainians' war effort. Less weaponry is now flowing from the United States to Ukraine because it's flowing to the Middle East. Furthermore, the Russians are getting wealthier and wealthier because they're selling more and more oil on world markets because we've greatly reduced sanctions on Russia. So the Russians, who you and I would agree were in the catbird seat in the Ukraine war before the Iran war started, are even in better shape today. So at some point, I think what's going to happen here is that Ukraine is going to clearly lose on the battlefield. The Russians are clearly going to be in the driver's seat. And that is going to have huge consequences for NATO. Because again, the question is going to be who's responsible for this catastrophe. And President Trump is going to say, it's not me, it's the Europeans. And as you know, President Trump has been reducing the American commitment to Ukraine over time. And he has been saying the burden of dealing with Ukraine is on the shoulders of the Europeans. So he, in a very important way, has positioned himself to blame the Europeans and to blame NATO for what is coming down the pike in Ukraine. So I would imagine that sometime, probably in the late summer, you're going to have this 1-2 blow where it's manifestly clear that the war in Iran is a significant defeat for the United States, and the United States and its European allies have been defeated in the Ukraine war. And this is going to put President Trump in a terrible position. And my point to you is he's going to try to blame the Europeans. He's going to try to blame NATO. And this is going to just make a disastrous situation in terms of transatlantic relations even worse.
And I think that there's no question he would do that. It's just in DNA to always to blame somebody else for anything that goes wrong, take credit for everything that goes right, no matter who actually had it. So that's for sure. But let's take a look at it from the European perspective here a minute. Let's just say for the moment that President Trump will, have a lot of bark tonight, but he will not declare anything per se. That it's still a pressure tactic to try to get him to do something, and so he doesn't literally walk away. But what is the long-term implications for the Ukrainians? I'm sorry, for the Europeans, because they have to. I mean, you talk about putting you and I in different people's positions. If I'm in the European position right now, I'm thinking, forget about America, man. I can't count on them ever. I don't want to put my national security in the hands of somebody that can make these kinds of decisions and could, in a tantrum, be gone in a minute. I need to start looking for ways to decouple from the U.S. and start providing for our own. Maybe, fellas, we should all get together, something like that. How do you see that happening? And is NATO effectively already dead?
I agree with you on how the Europeans should act. I think that, the Mark Rutte approach, where you kiss up to daddy. And think that you can appease Trump and get him to behave in positive ways towards you is a foolish way to do business. I think the Europeans have a vested interest in basically breaking their formal ties with the United States as much as possible, and acting independently. If I were the Europeans, I'd go to great lengths to improve relations with China. I'd look to trade with China. And if they were really smart, they'd look to improve relations with the Russians. As you and I agree, Russia's no threat to Europe, and they ought to figure that out for themselves and go to great lengths to improve relations with Russia, as well as with China, and keep distance from the United States. I mean, I think any country that gets close to the United States or closer to the United States than it has to is remarkably foolish. I've said this to both the Indians and the Pakistanis in recent months, and I would say it to the Gulf states if I were talking to them. What's the lesson of all this for the Gulf states? That, you do not want to be too close to the United States. You do not want to depend for your security on the United States, because it oftentimes acts in irresponsible ways, and it doesn't really care that much about your security.
And let's take one more look, and I know you're running low on time here, but let's take a look at from the Europeans. If what you and I think is going to happen, that whatever Trump may want to do, he's not going to be able to walk away, or at least he's not going to walk away without leaving Iran completely in control of the Hormuz and all the oil that goes along with it. So we're probably going to be in an extended period of high oil prices, which is going to cause obviously a problem for the entire European economy on top of what's already a rickety economy. And then they got to be looking over there and saying, you know what, maybe we need to turn on that Nord Stream 1 pipeline back again and make some kind of deal there. Will there be pressure for Europe to actually come to some kind of terms with Russia just out of economic necessity?
There may very well be. We haven't talked about this possibility either, but there is a possibility that if the global economy begins to go off a cliff, if things over the next couple of weeks begin to look like they're spinning out of control, and we're facing a global depression like we've never seen before. I'm not saying that is going to happen, but it is a possibility. If the global economic outlook becomes so terrible, you may find a situation where President Trump has no choice but to cut a deal with the Iranians and give them pretty much everything they want. And that's basically what you're saying about the Europeans. You're saying the Europeans could get into a situation that is so disastrous from an economic point of view. And of course, that will mean from a political and a social point of view as well, because it won't just simply be an economic disaster, right? So you're in this disastrous situation. You're the Europeans. What do you do? And when you're in a disastrous situation like that, as you and I know, you sometimes do things that you never dreamed of doing before you found yourself in that disaster. And that's what I'm saying about the world economy and President Trump. We're in uncharted waters here, and I think almost everybody understands that there is a giant iceberg out there, and there's good reason to think that we're headed for the iceberg. And if you believe that, then taking drastic action begins to look like a plausible way of moving forward.
And I think we could argue that the very real potential for striking that iceberg could be something that President Trump says later tonight. So we're going to have to wait and see what's going to happen with that. But whether you're talking about Europe, whether you're talking about U.S., Israel, our GCC Gulf allies, the economies in the Asia, which are already, even South Korea is already starting to ration fuel. Vietnam is having protests because they're running out of all kinds of everything. Global agriculture is an issue. I saw on Australia tomorrow or yesterday, rather, is having some serious problems already. And we're barely at the beginning of this kind of stuff. So if I could, just the last few minutes you have here, kind of wrap this up and say, how do you see the state of global peace and security, if I can say it like that?
Well, I think that you summed it up very well. We're in a desperate situation.
And I'm sorry, let me amend my question. If you were put in charge of the world, what would you do right now to try to mitigate some of these? I think some of them are baked in already, but what could you do to mitigate so we don't get to the worst outcomes?
Well, what has to be done is the Iran war has to be shut down. The strait has to be opened up, or at least oil, gas, fertilizer, what have you, have to flow through the Strait of Hormuz the way they did on February 27th. And the fighting between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side has to stop. And we're going to have to accommodate the Iranians to achieve all that. The question you have to ask yourself, Danny, is whether or not that's politically feasible, right? I mean, let's assume that we're sort of headed towards the iceberg, and President Trump and his advisors understand that. The question is, what can they do? They believe, as we were talking about before, that they can simply declare victory and walk away. That's the view. Their view is that there is a solution that's not terrible. And given President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu's ability to spin stories, they can tell a plausible story about how we achieved our goals and how we won this war. And we can walk away, and maybe you'll get a de facto ceasefire, right? The Iranians will see we're not hitting them anymore, so they won't have any incentive to hit us or to hit Israel. That's sort of the story. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do you believe we can do that, right? Do you believe that President Trump's speech tonight, assuming that it goes the way we were describing, will provide the magic formula for, not hitting the iceberg? And as you and I were saying, that's extremely unlikely, that this war is likely to go on. And as I like to emphasize, you never want to lose sight of the economic consequences of this war. And not only the fact that oil is not flowing out of the Gulf and fertilizers are not flowing out of the Gulf, but also the fact that economic infrastructure inside the Gulf is being destroyed.
Yeah.
And that economic infrastructure, when I use the word economic, I'm choosing my words carefully here, because it's not just oil. It's all sorts of economic infrastructure, aluminum plants, steel plants, desalination plants, and so forth and so on. So a lot of damage is being done here that's going to take a long time to repair, and that's going to have serious economic consequences. So I'm not sure that, I am sure that Trump can't pull off this simple exit strategy that he has in mind. But
I just worry about it turning into something worse. That's
right.
That's the question.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And then what do we do? So if it doesn't work tonight and over the next week, it's clear that, this one's not coming to an end easily, and people begin to see that it's continuing to spin out of control, and we are headed towards the iceberg, however you want to put it. The question is, what is President Trump going to do? He doesn't really have good options. Sending ground forces, this is not a serious argument. As we said before, it makes the terrible situation even worse. So again, what all this highlights to me, Danny, is that the Iranians are in the driver's seat. To use the rhetoric we were using before, they have us over a barrel. And if you believe that they have Danny Davis class aircraft carriers and charge over there, right, they're going to really play hardball with us.
Well, it's hard to argue with any of your logic there. I would love to, but I can't find any. And I'm having a hard time finding some silver linings here. There are some mitigations, but again, it takes somebody with some political courage and wisdom to know when to just finally fold your hands and put them up and say, I don't have the cards here. Let's don't, up the ante and call somebody that I can't play those cards. But not a lot of hope for that. But we'll wait and see. Maybe I'll be surprised President Trump has pulled a rabbit out of his hat. Let's just keep some hope alive for what happens at 9 o'clock tonight.